Hi, I'm Jeff Abramson. I'm a senior fellow at the Arms Control Association and manage something called the Forum on the Arms Trade. I want to thank Demand Progress for putting together this panel called Flipping the Script on U.S. Arms Sales. We're in for a great discussion. I'm going to talk a little bit about the frame for this conversation, and then we're going to turn it over to some of our great panelists. One of the things that I think many people do realize is the United States is by far the largest provider of weapons around the world. I'm going to share a little bit about some recent findings from different sources right now that give you a feel for this and some of the issues involved with that. So just this month, SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research, issued its yearly assessment of what countries are selling. And the United States continues to be a growing presence in the global trade of conventional major weapons. This is what SIPRI looks at. It found that the United States accounts for 39% of all exports of these weapons around the world, which was up from 32% just 5 years ago, and more than twice that of Russia, which is at 19%. We also often hear about China. China in the last 5 years, as Russia did, saw an actual decline in their contributions to the global arms sales. With that role that the United States has, there's lots of research in looking at how we do in terms of providing arms to conflict, whether we show restraint. And just last week, Jennifer Erickson at the World Peace Foundation had a great report that I'll recommend you read, and we'll share links and tell you how to find these, called On the Front Lines, Conflict Zones and U.S. Arms Exports, where she looked at case studies with our exports to Libya, Nigeria, South Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, and generally found that despite some great laws on the books, the president pretty much has the authority to do so far what it's always been he so far, wants to do without much restraint. And also that the US generally tends to continue arms transfers to conflict zones if it has relationships with countries in there. Knowing that, there's been a lot of discussion about changing how we look at arms transfers, with potentially making Congress much more involved, possibly even what we call flip the script, which is where Congress would have to approve arms sales rather than the case that it is right now. And there's just new report out today, actually, from the University of Maryland's program for public consultation, where they asked this question: would you be in favor of Congress having this role? And bipartisan 61% majorities said they would favor this. This is really interesting finding. It was pretty similar amongst Republicans, which were 56%, and Democrats 68%, and Independents 61%. But that 6 in 10 Americans, when they're informed of this policy, approve of it, is quite a telling piece on how people are thinking about arms sales today. There's another resource I just want to share, which I think Annie will talk about, which is a great primer on U.S. arms sales that came out from the American Bar Association and the Center for Civilians and Conflict Civic last month, which gives a rundown of what the laws are now, because there are a lot of laws on the books. We know that lots of arms sales have been controversial lately. There have been efforts in Congress to change how this is done, and that's really what we want to talk about today. In this panel, we're going to talk about how the United States sells weapons, where it is controversial, what the human rights concerns will be, and what something like flipping the script might mean in terms of how Congress and how the United States engages in the arms trade. We have a great set of panelists who bring expertise from civil society, from actually working inside the administrations, from working in Congress, and we would love questions as this goes along. Those can be sent to the email you see at the bottom of the screen here, or if you're watching through the Demand Progress site, you can put them in the box, or if you're watching on Twitter, you can send them through tweets, but we're looking forward to questions. But let me quickly introduce the panelists, who afterwards I'll then ask a few questions, and then we'll take it over to the audience as much as we can. Gerrard is the Advocacy Director of Democracy for the Arab World Now, DAWN, which is based in Washington, D.C. He's going to have to leave a little bit after we get started, unfortunately, but he'll be answering here in the first question. He immigrated to the United States in 2005 from the Middle East and has since been working on political issues pertaining to U.S. engagement in the Arab world. So he's going to offer a lot of insights there. Annie Shiel is the Senior Advisor for the United States at the Center for Civilians and Conflict, CIVIC. She leads their work on engaging with U.S. policymakers, lawmakers, and advocates to enhance protection of civilians in conflict. And amongst the many things she's done, she actually spent 3 years at the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor in what we call DRL, which is one of the key aspects we have within the administration to pay attention to human rights as we think about arms trade. So she can provide insights there as well. And then I'm really delighted Diana Olbaum is also joining in, who is the Senior Strategist and Legislative Director for Foreign Policy at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, which is a Quaker lobby here in Washington, D.C. Diana has done so many things in her career, one of which was she actually helped overhaul the Foreign Assistance Act, which is one of the key pieces of legislation related to arms trade. And she was a senior professional staff member at the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So has a lot of insights on how Congress deals and thinks about these things. So with that introduction, I hope I covered what I meant to. I want to launch us into questions. And we're going to talk a little bit amongst ourselves as panelists and quickly respond, and then we're going to move over. But the first question I'm going to direct to Annie Shiel and then to Raed. But really, the question for you two both, starting with Annie, is how do you think about the harm that can be caused by U.S. arms transfers? What is the problem we're dealing with in terms of harm in the world?
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. So you could certainly map out many various forms of harm from the arms trade and from the U.S. arms trade in particular. But there are three main buckets of risk that I'd like to focus on today. The first is going to be the most obvious, right? So when a weapon is directly linked to a harmful action by the recipient of that weapon. So for example, we know that this missile may be likely to be used by a US partner by the recipient to kill civilians. The second bucket is what we call diversion, right? So when a weapon intended for a certain party gets transferred to another party without authorization, which we see especially often with small arms and light weapons. This is where most traditional arms transfer policies focus. And the risk they're often most concerned with, but remains a really big issue. And then the third bucket, which I think is often very underappreciated in US policy, is the impact on impunity. And what I mean by that is, think about when a US arms transfer might not be used directly for civilian harm or directly in a human rights abuse, but the US decision to transfer that weapon sends a signal of acquiescence to that government's harmful behavior, right? A stamp of approval, essentially. So those are the main three buckets of harm that I think we'll be talking about addressing today.
Great, thanks, Annie. And Ryan, could you sort of give us a sense of some of the examples you've seen of these?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having me. I apologize about having to drop off the call soon. The three tracks that Annie mentioned have been extremely concerning to us while we're watching arms transfers, whether these arms transfers happen as a part of the United States arms sales to countries around the world, or whether they happen within the framework of donations, financing of military weapons with US tax dollars. The examples that I want to give is the most obvious ones when it comes to direct harm would be the United States military aid that has been used in war crimes in Gaza, for example. The United States continues to give Israel $3.8 billion. Actually, this year it's up to almost $5 billion. Many of these weapons have been used in documented war crimes in Gaza, or even gross violations of human rights inside the West Bank and inside 48 Israel by many organizations, including extrajudicial killing by Israeli checkpoints. We saw also direct harm by US bombs that were sold to Saudi Arabia. For example, back in 2018, there was a very well-documented war crime that happened when the Saudi-led coalition bombed a bus in Yemen, killing 26 children and wounding 19 more. These war crimes actually happen very, very frequently. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have documented dozens of apparent war crimes in Yemen, in other parts of the region, Libya sometimes, with the use of US weapons. It's extremely concerning that we continue to see these direct violations with US weapons, which is in many cases in violation of existing US law. We'll talk about that later. The second track that Annie mentioned is the diversion. And with that one, we saw some of the UAE, the weapons that were sent to the United Arab Emirates were diverted to Iranian-backed militias around Yemen. A more striking example is what happens inside Iraq, where the US has funded and aided the Iraqi government. The Iraqi government is very connected to many sectarian militias. A few years ago, there was this horrific video of a US Abrams tank an entire tank, not a bullet, a tank that was used by one of the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, Hezbollah brigades, had their flag flying on a U.S. Abrams tank running in Iraq. It's like when people ask about the size of the loopholes that we have with our end-use monitoring, I say it's so huge that it actually a tank can literally drive through it. And the last level that is the least covered, as Annie mentioned, is of course the issue of the complicity, and that is the political approval, the political support that comes with U.S. arms transfers. So we saw, for example, in Egypt and in Saudi Arabia, in some cases, the U.S. sold these countries weapons that were described as defensive. I don't think there is such thing as a defensive weapon. All weapons are weapons, but sometimes they're described as defensive, like helicopters for transferring equipment or like other kind of weapons. And when that happens, we have seen a pattern where these countries become more emboldened. They go after political dissidents. They put hundreds of more dissidents in prison in Egypt, or they go after dissidents in Saudi Arabia with more executions. Like we saw Saudi Arabia executing dozens of dissidents in the last few months. So, I mean, that is an important angle, that U.S. arms sales are indeed a stamp of approval. And they do provide these dictatorships with political capital that they end up using to oppress and go after their own people because they receive these U.S. weapons as a political cover for their actions. Let me stop here. I would have to hop out of the call, but I'll join you back in 30 minutes.
Thanks so much, Rad and Annie. It's really important to sort of understand what the potential harms will be. Obviously, the U.S. has law that is supposed to help prevent weapons from ending up being used in situations like this, whether intentionally or otherwise. So the next question we want to dig into really is sort of what might be the loopholes in the law? Why are we falling short? Why the stories of those examples that Raed mentioned, unfortunately, we could go back a decade before that or 2 decades before that, and we would still find these examples. So I wanted to start with Diana to sort of give us a feel for where you think 1 or 2 of the most important loopholes are right now, and then I'll turn it over to Annie also.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and also thanks to Kayvon and Demand Progress for holding this panel. Let me just say, it's not just a matter of loopholes. It is a matter of the whole structure of the law. And by that, I mean the Arms Export Control Act, which is the main piece of legislation that sets out the procedures by which arms sales can be made around the world, U.S. arms sales. Congress has ceded its authority to the executive branch and handicapped its own ability to conduct oversight of arms sales through this law, the Arms Export Control Act. There are many serious problems with the law, but the most fundamental one is that Congress is, in practical terms, unable to stop an arms sale, even if they know or expect that it will be used to perpetrate human rights abuses or violations of international law, that it's likely to be retransferred to another party who will do that. And the reason for that is that under the Arms Export Control Act, there is a presumption of approval. That is, arms transfers proceed unless Congress disapproves. And that basically requires a vote of 2/3 in both houses to override a presidential veto. And as a result of that law, Congress has never successfully blocked a proposed arms sale by use of a joint resolution of disapproval. The most obvious recent example was an $8 billion weapons sale to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other countries in May of 2019. It included precision-guided munitions of the very type that were used against civilians in Yemen. And President Trump, who was president at the time, invoked a very rarely used emergency provision of the Arms Export Control Act to expedite 22 arms sales to nearly a dozen countries. And he invoked this emergency provision, even though his own justification memorandum did not cite any new or changed threats. And some of the sales were actually manufacturing and co-production agreements that would take years to bear fruit. So resolutions to block these sales were introduced in both houses and passed by a bipartisan majority both times, 53 to 45 in the Senate, 238 to 190 in the House. Of course, the president vetoed them, and the veto was upheld in the Senate. There are a couple of articles that I wrote with my colleague Rachel Stoll on those, and I think those are probably on the Demand Progress website.
Thanks so much, Diana. Annie, would you like to add in on this as well?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I am happy to. I think there's a lot to say about current shortcomings in U.S. policy and law when it comes to arms transfers. And again, I will add some other details to the Demand Progress resource page. But given the focus of today's conversation, I think what I'd like to add to Diana's points is that in addition to those procedural issues, those are basically compounded by a lack of sufficient application of existing law, right? So as Diana noted, Congress has been unable to stop a sale using the joint resolution of disapproval process laid out in the Arms Export Control Act. But additionally, the Leahy laws, for example, despite the fact that the Leahy laws specifically prohibit assistance to security force units that have violated human rights, the executive branch does not currently vet most arms transfers under the Leahy laws due to their own narrow interpretation of, quote, assistance. Additionally, Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act, that also prohibits the U.S. from providing security assistance, including arms transfers, to any country engaged in a consistent pattern of human rights violations. And it also gives Congress the tools to request information from the executive branch about those human rights records and to terminate or condition sales on that basis. However, this tool also has very rarely been used. And again, as Jeff noted earlier, we do have a primer on this that I'll also be sure to add to that resource page. But essentially, as a result of the issues that Diana laid out and these other underutilized and underenforced laws, we still have a gap in congressional oversight of arms sales, and that is why flipping the script is so important.
Great, thanks, Annie. And maybe we'll turn our attention now to what the flipping the script approach might be. But let me continue to encourage people to send in questions. We've already got it. We had some ahead of time. We've got some good ones now. You can do that if you're watching on the website through the box or at the Demand Progress Twitter account. So there's a number of possible solutions here, but one has been this flip the script legislation, which was introduced in the House and the Senate last year as part of the broader packages. Diana, could you tell us a little bit more about what this does?
Sure, thanks. The basic idea behind flip the script is to change from a presumption of approval to a presumption of disapproval for arms sales, but not for every single case or every single arms sale that is proposed, because it would be very difficult to require Congress to approve every single sale that comes through. There are quite a number, and those who receive the notifications, they pile up on your desk very quickly. So the idea would be to pick the subset of countries and the specific types of weapons that are the most likely to cause problems. So the current procedures, which only require disapproval, would continue for NATO +5. So it's the NATO countries plus Australia, Japan, South Korea, Israel, and New Zealand. And for those, they would get the regular notification process. Those countries the arms sale would go through unless Congress disapproved. But for other countries, for weapons that are major weapon systems or issues or weapons of concern, and there's a list of the specific types of weapon systems that would be a problem, those would not go through unless Congress specifically approved them. So that's the basic concept behind flipping the script. And then there are all kinds of smaller aspects of it that would be helpful, such as tightening up the loophole for emergencies so that it has to be a true emergency and it has to be equipment that would be received right away. And procedures for making sure that you didn't have to have, 100 votes a year on arms sales, that you could package together a bunch of arms sales all together and approve them simultaneously and just keep out the ones that are the most problematic. So that's the basic structure of flipping the script.
Thanks so much, Diana. That's a great overview of what's going on there. Annie, would you want to talk a little bit about why this would be so important? And we've been hinting at it, but I think it's good to sort of give a feel for why so many people have been paying attention to this idea that actually was introduced by a member of the Senate named Joe Biden back in 1986. This is where this idea originally came from.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And I do think that point is really important and interesting. And we can also provide folks with that original text if anyone's interested. But yes, flip the script is hugely important because it restores Congress's power to act when it overwhelmingly disagrees with an arms sale for any reason. And I think that the sale to Saudi Arabia and the UAE that Diana described earlier is really the use case that we are solving for here, right? We should not have a scenario where Congress, who, as Diana mentioned, delegated arms sales authorities to the president in the first place. We should not have a scenario where Congress overwhelmingly opposes a sale, in this case, based on serious human rights and civilian harm concerns, and still does not have the power to block it. And also to Diana's point, many sales will likely continue to go through, which also means that this doesn't remove the need for other human rights centered reforms. So things that also exist already, like the Safeguard Act, have been introduced already, I should say, like the Safeguard Act, Stop Arming Human Rights Abusers Act, the Values and Arms Export Act. But what Flip the Script does, which is really important, is it places important power back in Congress and really forces Congress to do its job when it comes to oversight over US transfers of deadly weapons around the world.
Great, thanks so much. I mean, obviously, when we started planning this panel, the war in Ukraine had not broken out yet. And I think for anybody watching this now, that is at front of mind in ways. Let me start with a question for both of you that was asked before this event, and you've been talking about a bit, but do you feel like if this flip the script legislation was the law now, that it would slow down this sort of amazing provision of weapons to Ukraine? We may, not all of us on the call may, on this briefing may agree that they should be happening, but it definitely feels like Congress is behind, in general, these weapons transfers to Ukraine in this emergency situation. Do you see this legislation as somehow slowing that down or a hiccup in that effort? Diane, let me go to Diana first.
Sure. I'll just start by saying, without commenting on which particular weapons should be going to Ukraine, because there are some differences about which kind of weapons should be considered defensive or offensive and which one might escalate it. This particular proposal of flipping the script really would not have any effect on that. And the reason is that this is the perfect example of the correct use of the emergency provision. That's exactly what the emergency waiver is in there for, so that when you have a conflict that is hot, right in the middle of it, and weapons need to be transferred immediately, it skips over the whole 15 to 30-day notice procedure for Congress, and the weapons can be transferred immediately. What we would like to do, though, is tighten up that loophole so it doesn't apply to non-emergencies. So I don't think it would have any impact on Ukraine, but I defer to my colleague Annie if she sees it differently.
Yeah,
Annie, you have a thought on this?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. The only thing I would add to that is, the other reason I think it would not have an impact here is because Congress overwhelmingly approves the provision of weapons to Ukraine. So again, this is not a provision that would tie Congress's hands in any way. It puts power back in Congress to make sure that when there is a case that Congress overwhelmingly opposes, they have the power to stop it.
Yeah, that's how I was thinking as well. It does seem that Congress, if it were voting on this, would move it pretty quickly at this time. We got a question for Raed, who's gone, but Diana was talking about this, and I would love for us to talk a little bit about this offensive versus defensive weapons issue. And there's a lot of ways you can go about this conversation, and I might add some points in too. But maybe, Diana, since you were talking about it, if you want to jump in, and then Annie, if you have some thoughts on this dichotomy between offensive and defensive, is that a valid dichotomy? How are we seeing that play out right now? I don't think it would change necessarily to flip the script in any way, but as we think about this, this has become a very important issue. The arms that are now going to Saudi Arabia, absent the provision of, assistance that keeps the jets flying, the Biden administration said these are defensive weapons rather than offensive weapons. A lot of us think that that distinction doesn't work. But Diana and then Annie, do you have thoughts on how we think about and approach offensive/defensive?
Well, let me just say to start off that the legislation that we're discussing and the law doesn't make any distinction between offensive and defensive. So it wouldn't be impacted by flipping the script or any of the other changes we're talking about. I do think that offensive or defensive depends very highly on the situation and the likely use case for a particular weapon, and whether we are talking about the aggressor or a country that's being attacked. One of the problems is that it is hard to make that distinction. I will say the administration has refused to do that. They've been asked specifically by members of Congress when President Biden said that we would stop supplying offensive equipment to Saudi Arabia for use against Yemen. Nobody has ever clearly defined what offensive is. So Congress can't even tell whether the administration is adhering to its word. So that's another area where, the administration kind of has all the power, and Congress has found itself unable to conduct, reasonable oversight of that matter.
Great. Thanks, Diana. I'll also just reiterate the point that Raed made around the provision of these weapons, whether you consider them offensive or defensive, is legitimizing those countries. And there's been in this moment when there's so much attention on Ukraine and the war crimes, that are being committed there by the Russians, there's been so much less attention to what's happening in the Middle East, especially in Yemen. And a lot of the Middle East experts that we work with collectively have been pointing to the fact that the United States is arming the Saudis and the Emiratis, but the Saudis who've been bombing Yemen in many of the same ways that Russia has been bombing Ukraine. And if we were being consistent on these approaches, we would be talking about those as well. And even if we call these defensive weapons, that legitimization of that country or those countries receiving them is palatable and it's real. And the other thing that's often forgotten is that defensive weapons enable offensive. If you make an offensive-defensive distinction, having a defensive weapons enables your forces to be offensive, if that makes any sense in a way. I'd like to ask a question that was given to us ahead of time, and Annie was talking about this a bit, and I'll turn it first to Annie. In terms of what's some of the other legislation that's out there, you talked about how this wouldn't negate the need for some of the other legislation. Could you talk about some of the other major pieces that have been introduced in this Congress that you think are worth everyone knowing about?
Yeah, very happy to. So again, some of the other legislation that I mentioned, and I know I said it very fast, so I will say it slower this time. But those pieces of legislation that I'm about to describe, they are really complementary to Flip the Script. And by the way, I think we had another question too about the actual legislation behind Flip the Script, and that is in legislation right now. So we have the National Security Powers Act that was introduced in the Senate by Senators Murphy, Lee, and Sanders. You also have the National Security Reforms and Accountability Act that was introduced in the House by Representatives McGovern, Meyer, DeFazio, Mace, Lee, Castro, and Liu. And if I'm missing anyone, I'm very sorry about that. But that is, Flip the Script is part of that package and is really exciting and something that we hope will move forward. And then there are these other pieces of legislation that are really complementary to Flip the Script, right? So whereas Flip the Script does what Diana describes and changes the tools available to Congress to exert oversight, there are other pieces of legislation that add requirements to what the executive branch can do and the steps the executive branch has to take to consider things like human rights and civilian harm. So again, those include the Safeguard Act that was introduced by Menendez that would add a number of requirements. It would explicitly amend the Leahy law to include arms transfers, although again, Leahy law is already meant to cover arms transfers, but it would make that more explicit. It would prohibit sales to countries that have committed genocide or violations of IHL. It would require recipients to agree to certain stipulations around human rights in IHL, which you might be surprised to consider is not part of standard terms and agreements, and a number of other requirements as well. You also have the Stop Arming Human Rights Abusers Act, which again would similarly add requirements to the executive branch. It would also establish a commission on atrocity, accountability, and human rights to monitor violations of human rights in IHL. And then, oh, actually, I think I'm getting my legislation confused, and that was Murray's Safeguard Act, which is all, oh my God, Murray's Values in Arms Export Act. And lastly, Omar's Stop Arming Human Rights Abusers Act would also add a number of really important requirements to the executive, and again, would also prohibit sales to countries that have committed genocide and violations of IHL, among other atrocities. So again, there are a number of really important bills out there. I will put those all into that resource page so that you do not get as confused as I just did, but rest assured, they are all really fantastic pieces of legislation. They all complement each other in really important ways, and they're all really necessary to ensure that the U.S. arms sales do not make the world a less safe place the way they so often do today.
Thanks so much, Annie. I'm going to come back to you now for a follow-up that we received in the questions, which is how is this related to end use monitoring? When you talked about the buckets of concerns at the start, well, part of it was around lack of attention to the end use of these weapons. Do those pieces of legislation touch on that, or are there other approaches that you want to mention in terms of tackling the end use side and defining that a little bit more fully?
Yes, thank you for asking that, because as you know, Jeff, this is a huge pet peeve of mine, which is the fact that end use monitoring, despite its name, does not actually monitor the use of US weapons. So, if you recall to the beginning of this conversation, I mentioned diversion and how that's something that US policy tends to care a little bit more about. And indeed, end use monitoring is mostly focused on actually checking to make sure that US weapons are where the end user says they're going to be, right? That the person who is in control of them is still who is in control of them. And it does not look at how they are actually being used. So it does not look at, whether that weapon that morning had been used in a human rights violation or had been used in civilian harm. And it certainly does not, meet that third bucket that I mentioned around how weapons affect complicity or impunity. So it is still a huge gap. It is another area where I think there is more space for legislation. And certainly, again, I think it's important to note that all the things we're talking about, maybe with the exception of flip the script, these are all things that the executive branch could decide today to start doing on their own. So that is also important, right? They could change end use monitoring to make it actually monitor use. They could decide to start applying the Leahy law to arms transfers. So there's a lot that they could do on their own as well to meet that commitment that Biden has made and that Secretary Blinken has made to center human rights in US foreign policy.
Great, thanks, Annie. And as Annie said, she and others have done some amazing work that will be sure shared afterwards on thinking about this end use monitoring, which really is a critical piece of understanding the U.S. engagement and involvement in the arms trade in the world, which is overlooked very importantly. I'd like to turn to a question that we always get and was asked of us as well, which is, this legislation might limit the president's hand, this or the other ones we were talking about. And wouldn't that mean that Russia and China would jump in and fill the gap? Why would we want to limit our capabilities if there's other providers out there? We hear this question a lot, and I wanted to give Diana a first crack at talking about this, and then I'll turn it to Annie to see if she wants to add on to that, excuse me.
Thanks, Jeff. And, I really resist this idea that this is limiting the president's flexibility somehow. First of all, because it is Congress's job to play a role in this. They deserve a voice in this, and the American people deserve a voice in this. So it is not taking some power that is implicitly held by the president away. It is reclaiming a role that Congress has played and should play. But second of all, I will say that there's always that argument. Oh, if we don't do it, someone else will. And what's so important about that is really the case that Annie made earlier about complicity, and Raed talked about that too. So it doesn't benefit us to sell arms to countries that will misuse them, transfer them to the wrong people, or use them in ways that abuse human rights, because that only harms us, not only in terms of our international reputation, but in terms of our own ability to act. I mean, when hostile powers are using our own weapons against us, that's pretty bad. So I think Congress should want to make sure that these things aren't going to happen, instead of just saying, oh, Russia or China, or in many cases they will say France or Germany will make the sale instead. We should talk with France and Germany and make this a matter of, instead of competition to see who can sell the most advanced weapons to the most dictatorial country, we should be talking to them about limiting these arms transfers and keeping ourselves from becoming complicit in these abuses.
Annie, you want to add in?
Yeah, I think again to that, I'm always really happy to get the question around, what Diana was alluding to, if we don't sell it, someone else will, because it's something that we hear all the time. And I think it's a really important argument to debunk. And I think there are a few questions here. Forgive me, Jeff, might be a slightly long answer, but I'm passionate about getting it right. So, first of all, let's look at the argument itself. I think it's important to recognize that arms sales are not simply a financial transaction, right? They are an act of foreign policy, in the sense that the US is sending deadly weapons around the world that, again, have the capacity for significant harm. I think when you look at the argument at its base, first of all, it's important to recognize that just swapping out, in this case, Chinese or Russian arms, which is often the kind of specter that the US uses in this argument, that just swapping out arms is not actually as easy or likely as this argument suggests. So, for countries like Saudi Arabia, for example, that purchase large amounts of US weapons, there are interoperability challenges that come up when you try to pick one piece from here and one piece from here. But really the more important question is, even if they did turn away from the US and buy a weapon elsewhere, how much would it really matter? And I think the answer is not nearly as much as proponents of this argument say that it might be, and especially not when it's weighed against the immense harm that those weapons are likely to cause. This is something, again, that I could go into much more detail on, but I'll just say really briefly, I think the does it matter argument often hinges on economic arguments around US jobs. There's a lot of research that I'm happy to talk more about that debunks the impact of the US arms trade on US jobs, and the way that the industry actually contributes to US job growth. And then the other piece of the argument is around political influence. And that's another piece where there's not a lot of evidence that US arms are really a powerful tool of political influence. And if the face of US foreign policy is weapons, then you have a problem, right? That is not a deep alliance. That is not a deep partnership. And that is a challenge that you have to address some other way. But on their own, arms are not going to buy influence. And in fact, are often actively harmful to US interests in the way that they exacerbate instability, fuel regional arms races, fuel conflict, and again, of course, facilitate human rights abuses. So I will stop there, but again, happy to provide more on the demand progress research page.
Thanks so much. I think we've covered a lot of the standard things that we talk about in this. I just want to flag a little bit that what Diana said in terms of talking with our allies, just as I've been reflecting on the rhetoric of the last actual year, but just thinking about the President Biden's speech on Saturday, which I haven't read in full, but where he continues to frame this moment as democracy standing up, democracies acting better. And I think I haven't run the latest SIPRI data because it just came out this month. But when I last did, I compared the countries that were invited to the Summit for Democracies to where the United States was selling its weapons. And almost half of its major weapons were going to countries that aren't democracies. And if you make that understanding and you think about, if we really want to change the way the world operates, we need to change the way we operate. So I think, we have more sway, obviously, with our allies than we do on what Russia and China will do. But this is why something like the Arms Trade Treaty, which is trying to set these global norms that the United States has not been a part of and President Trump moved us away from. There are some opportunities out there in the world, especially if we live up to the frame we're trying to create, to really start moving away from arms sales first foreign policy, as Diana and Annie are talking about, another way to approach the world. Welcome. I want to turn to another question that we get a lot of and start with Diana. And then after that question, I might come and return to some questions about public opinion, because I talked about it briefly, but I know Annie has also looked at some other studies. But let me ask this, Diana, what do you think the feasible paths are for getting this through Congress? How you spend a lot of time, you're located across the street from the Congress. What have been some of your thoughts on this at this point?
Thanks, Jeff. And look, I don't want to be naive about this. It is hard to get anything passed through Congress these days. That is just a reality we are dealing with. But this flip the script idea is part of a larger package. The National Security Powers Act and its House counterpart are based on a premise of changing the balance of power between the White House and Congress. So the other parts of the law, of the proposed of the legislation, would also make revisions to the War Powers Act and the National Emergencies Act. And in all three cases, with those two and with the Arms Export Control Act, the idea is for Congress to take back some of its constitutionally mandated powers. And that is not really a partisan issue. There are bipartisan co-sponsors of this bill, and there have been Republicans and Democrats alike have voted for changes, whether you're talking about repealing the 2002 authorization for use of military force or stopping weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. There have been real bipartisan agreement on this. So, the way is there if the will is there. I know that it is totally on us, the NGOs who are working on these, to get the American people to weigh in with their members of Congress, because I know that most offices hear very little about this from their constituents. It's not an issue that has received the attention it truly deserves. But I think when people are asked, they actually agree with what this legislation does, which leads right into what I think Jeff wanted to talk about with some of the public opinion polls relating to this.
Thanks so much, Diana. And Riyad, welcome back. We're glad you were able to rejoin us. Just so folks know, if you do want to find these resources, it's at bit.ly/flipping the script panel. So that's us, flipping the script panel, and it's a bit.ly in front of that. I do now want to talk to some of the public opinion around the U.S. engagement in the arms trade and whether it makes us safer. I talked a little bit at the beginning about this brand new study out of the University of Maryland, where they actually presented both cases for why this legislation would be good and what have been the knocks on this legislation, and asked people, and in a bipartisan way, 60% said they would favor Congress having this authority that's in the flip the script. But there are other public opinion polls, and I wanted to turn to Annie first. I think she pays attention to some of those and can mention them, but maybe also after that, I'll ask Riyad, as he talks about this, and I didn't mention that Dawn, the organization he works for, was founded by Jamal Khashoggi, and I think the attention put on the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi actually, in that time period in the last few years, brought the most attention to the U.S. arms trade. When Diana was talking about the veto that had to be used and could not be overridden a few years ago, I wonder if, after Annie talks about what she's seen in the public opinion, if Riyad wanted to add how he has heard conversation change and how he thinks the public generally resonates with ideas around the arms trade and the different things that he's talked about. So Annie, if I could go to you and then Ryan, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jeff, I know you have seen that latest research a little closer than I have, so please feel free to jump in with that. But yes, there are a number of polls that, again, I don't think they're on that resource page yet, but I'm happy to add them. There are a number of polls that have shown us that American voters generally do not want to see U.S. weapons going to authoritarian regimes or going to human rights abusers. So there's a poll by Data for Progress and Common Defense that found that 58% of voters want to see the U.S. stop selling weapons to authoritarian regimes that commit human rights abuses under the guise of counterterrorism. And that was true even when they were presented with the argument that that would mean a loss of U.S. business, of U.S. dominance or influence in critical regions. There was also a poll by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs in 2019 that found that 70% of Americans oppose arms sales to other nations and see the transactions as a threat to national security, in fact. And that view actually crossed traditional partisan lines. So it includes 75% of Democrats, 70% of independents, and 62% of Republicans who expressed a lack of safety associated with arms sales. And then there's also been polling by Rethink Media that found that restricting arms sales to human rights abusing governments enjoyed overwhelming support, especially among Democrats, with 87% of Democrats agreeing that the US should not be selling weapons to human rights abusing authoritarian governments. And then, of course, as we've talked about, we've also seen in Congress bipartisan support for blocking harmful sales, such as the sale to Saudi Arabia and UAE that failed because of the challenges we described today. And Ryan, maybe you want to talk a little bit about that sale and the circumstances around it.
Thank you, Annie, and thank you, Jeff. And apologies again about having to hop off the call for the last 30 minutes. I do want to build on what Jeff said earlier about Jamal Khashoggi. I do work with the organization that was founded by the late Jamal Khashoggi. And for those who are not familiar with this case, he is the Saudi journalist who was killed in the Saudi embassy in Istanbul, or the consulate in Istanbul. And my organization was founded by him, but he was killed right before he launched it. So we ended up launching the organization in 2020. One of our main demands is to call for justice for Jamal Khashoggi. And justice for Jamal Khashoggi comes in the case, it comes in the way of holding those behind his murder accountable, but also it comes in the form of not selling more weapons to the government, the Saudi government, that is behind the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. So we have worked with many members of Congress, including Congressman Connolly, in introducing a number of legislations. One of them was the Saudi Dissidents Act. It actually passed the House last year. And not only passed the House, a variation of it also passed as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act. And the act, or the Khashoggi language in there, required suspending U.S. Arms transfers in some form to Saudi Arabia, because many of us are tired with fighting these arms transfers one transfer at a time. We have joint resolutions of disapproval coming to the floor of the Senate and the floor of the House to block an arms sales to Egypt here, and then arms sale to Saudi Arabia there, and arms sales to Israel there. And it's very difficult for these resolutions to pass, but even if they're passed, we see that the White House steps in to veto them. So the idea was to create a standalone legislation that would suspend the transfer of weapons to abusive governments. And that is what we need. What we need is a comprehensive catch-all mechanism that will stop selling and moving weapons to abusive governments. Back in the day, we had a couple of hopes. We had hopes that, for example, the Arms Transfer Treaty, the ATT, would play that role. It has been signed but not ratified by the Senate. Back in the day, under President Obama, there was a presidential policy directive, PPD 27, that also attempted to suspend any form of arms transfer to governments that have been accused or involved in a pattern of gross violations of human rights or war crimes. Now we're dealing with this one-by-one case, and we're lost in a debate about whether weapons are defensive or weapons are offensive, which is completely besides the point. I think, like as a community in DC, and I appreciate Civic and Annie's leadership on this. Like we are trying to regroup and be more strategic in our demands. Our demands are to change the current laws and regulations and the implementation of current laws and regulations to ensure that no more US weapons will go to abusive governments, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Israel or UAE or any other abusive governments who are involved in war crimes and gross violations of human rights.
Thanks so much, Rayed. I think you touched upon there also, just as we've been talking about, there is existing law that if we would use it, it would also be good. So I think that there's a whole set of range of possibilities we've been talking about here. One of the questions we got, and it's a bit in the weeds, but we wanted to answer it real quickly, and then I think we'll either go for closing comments or take one more, is the distinction between a foreign military sale, a government-to-government sale, and one that's more what we call direct commercial sale, where the company itself is engaged in the negotiations. I'm going to turn this over to Annie a bit. There is a distinction in terms of how these go about, but in function, these are still things that Congress should have a role in terms of oversight. And Annie, if you could just sort of remind again where that oversight is sort of embedded in the law, that would be great. And you can give you a chance to also talk about this primer we've talked a little bit about.
Yeah, happy to. So I would say the most important thing to know when it comes to looking at direct commercial sales, so sales coming directly from a company to a foreign recipient versus government-to-government sales, is that when it comes to direct commercial sales, the US government is far less involved. So it is a licensing process. There are not as many kind of safeguard steps as there are in a direct government-to-government sale, which is not to say that they are sufficient in the case of a government-to-government sale, as I alluded to. And then the other really big difference is transparency. We have very, very little transparency into arms sales that are going through this direct commercial sales process, which is a huge challenge for oversight, a huge challenge for organizations like ours that are trying to make this process better. So, and I know actually, Rayed, that you recently did a great briefing on transparency, so you may want to add more to that. But we did recently put out a brief that goes into some of these challenges, which I will also make sure is on that resource page. So, yeah.
But just to add in on that, which is really important, these sales would still be under the oversight of this flip the script legislation. And they are in theory under the oversight now, but as Annie said, there's such a greater lack of transparency that the public certainly has almost no ability to weigh in on this. Members of Congress in theory do if they're sharing it. Ryan, I see you've unmuted. Did you want to jump in, or should I move us to some final thoughts?
I just want to add something very quickly, which is regarding this transparency. Like as was mentioned earlier, the direct commercial sales, the vast majority of them fly under the radar, and we have no idea how many billions of dollars are sold with absolutely no transparency. And even for those who are notified, last year we figured out that there is some literal glitch in the Senate software where parliamentarians in the Senate are unable to put the information correctly to notify members of Congress that there are these sales happening, which sounds like a joke. We're talking about, we're like a $4 trillion government in the US, and we're selling hundreds of billions of dollars worth of weapons. And the fact that there is a funny administrative glitch where parliamentarians are unable to report sales to members of Congress is like really mind-boggling. I can't believe that this is actually a glitch. It's just lack of political will to create these systems. And I mean, I think, like as Annie was saying earlier, like some of these issues need like overhaul fixes, new structures to fix them. But some of them are literally just tweaks to existing systems that are dysfunctional, which, whether it's under the Foreign Assistance Act, whether it's under the Arms Export Control Act, whether it's just internal mechanisms for reporting and transparency for who gets to know what.
Thanks, Ryan. I know we're in our last 5 minutes here, and I really appreciate the panelists, and I want to thank ahead of time Demand Progress for organizing this. I think as the resources are shared afterwards, folks will know they can always contact any of us for further follow-up. I wanted to give all the panelists one last chance to say a comment, and it could be broader than what we've been talking about today. I mean, I think I'll end with Diana, if you want to talk sort of about this moment and militarization and countering militarization. That might be a concluding spot. But maybe I'll go to Annie first, and then Rayad, in terms of any final thoughts about this legislation or this moment as a way to indicate the need for continued work on this, but any other topic that we maybe haven't delved in as deeply as you'd like. And then I'll thank everybody finally for joining in. But Annie, then Rayad, then Diana, please.
Yeah, I would just say that, the importance of approaches like Flip the Script and like the other bills that I mentioned, which again, please head to that resource page. I bungled them a little bit, but they're all important. And so, go learn about those. Their importance is enduring, right? And if calls to end U.S. involvement in endless war are successful, which I think the job is certainly not done there yet, that this more militarized tool of arms sales will continue to be relied upon. And I think as we are in this era of great power competition, and as the U.S., I personally hope is less involved directly in conflicts around the world, we'll continue, I think, to see a trend of the U.S. really relying heavily on security assistance, and often relying on security assistance to partners that may not share the same vision that the U.S. has, or may not share U.S. interests, or the values that the U.S. Says it would like to espouse. And so I think that it will continue to be very important to marry these two approaches of, increasing congressional oversight on the one hand, and also adding more requirements of the executive branch when it comes to human rights and civilian harm. And I think sometimes that's hard to see when we are not in the middle of a moment like we were that Diana mentioned, but that importance really, really continues. Arms sales and U.S. arms around the world continue to affect civilians. They continue to contribute to human rights abuses. They continue to contribute to civilian harm. And so we will also make sure, I think, in that resource page, if you visit it, that there are, is a lot of information from really amazing activists around the world who have been documenting that. So it's still important, and I hope that you learn more.
Go ahead, Ryan.
Thank you, Annie. I think what I want to add is that the last 4 weeks, the war in Ukraine did send a clear message to us in Washington, D.C. and to the rest of the world. We have been told over and over that we are naive and we don't understand international relations because selling weapons to these abusive governments will give the United States more political leverage. That's not true. I mean, we saw what happened with the UAE. We saw what happened with Israel. The US has sold and given tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons to these countries, and the US has no political leverage over them when it comes to their decisions and foreign policy. I think the United States has been questioned in the last few weeks that our own political leverage has been diminished because of our actions. And the right path forward is for the US to follow our own laws and regulations and stop supporting dictators and abusive governments around the world so that we will have that political and moral voice when other invasions and wars happen around the world. I think what's happened in Ukraine is a reminder that overhauling the system of arms transfers is important, not only for human rights, but for the United States political capital.
Thanks. And Diana?
Yes, thanks. And at the risk of raising something at the last moment that we haven't talked about previously, I just want to note that many people see arms sales as an alternative to US military involvement. They believe that if we sell the weapons, then we don't have to send US troops. And I just want to really bring home the point that that is the opposite. That when we sell weapons, we have a continuing responsibility not only to provide training and spare parts and often servicing from these weapons, but it creates an expectation that we will continue to help protect that country and engage with it in whatever conflict it's in. So it actually, these arms sales are often a way of drawing the United States into conflicts that we would prefer not to have any involvement in. So it is really important that Congress think about it right from the start.
Thanks so much, Diana, and thanks so much, Fred and Annie. I really appreciate you offering your insights and valuable lessons as we think about this. And I want to thank Demand Progress for hosting this event and say thank you all very much.